Just to put in perspective, maybe is to just understand how huge the debt problem is for Greece, and also it's also important to try and reflect what has triggered the current problem that Greece is facing. So Greece, like many of the countries in Europe, in the last decade or two, have borrowed extensively to fund their government programs. And most of this funding was towards the infrastructure. And for Greece in particular, I would say probably the Olympics, the Athens Olympics that were held a while back. And the biggest challenge that most of these countries have faced is that during the recession of 2007-8, thereabout, they stopped growing effectively. And hence, with the recession, meant that tax collections became lower. It means then governments came under pressure to service debt. And in the case for Greece, I think they had a huge debt in the range of 150% of their GDP. This is high because it's significantly higher than the Americans, who we know tend to have huge debts as a percent of GDP, significantly higher than the UK, which is at about 90%. And if we were to benchmark to Kenya, we are around 43%. So this is a huge amount of debt. And on the background of drop in revenues, tax collections because of economic recession in Greece, then the country is under pressure to pay its debt. And what Greece is going through is a bailout. So they can't pay back their debts. Their debts are due for repayment. And what they've been doing is to negotiate with Germany, who is probably their largest creditor, and how should they either reschedule the payments or what should they do to balance their books. And that's what the challenge has been. And I think in the next couple of days, they are due to default a loan to IMF. And just to put it in perspective, a default in the context of the money markets globally has got its consequences. What it means to Greece is that if they default the current repayment due to IMF, it also means that other creditors could demand repayment of their loans, effectively triggering a collapse of the Greek economy. If you put it in perspective, it's just like yourself. How much debt can you handle as a person? If you look at it, a country can be compared to a family. So the GDP could be compared to your earnings per year. So if you overborrow, you will struggle to survive. If you pay your debts on time, you will struggle to buy food, you will struggle to take your kids on holiday, you will struggle to invest elsewhere. The same thing is applicable to countries. So when countries borrow too much, then the options are limited. And in most cases, when they overborrow, then one of the biggest options that they struggle with is social safety net. Countries in Europe have got large social safety nets. In countries like ours in Kenya, we are just beginning to grow the safety net at the bottom, which safeguards a majority of the people. But when you start having to cut back on safety nets, then you have a political problem, which is what we are seeing in Greece. So is it bad to borrow? I think the answer is no, because it's inevitable that you'll have to borrow to spend on infrastructure and spend on large programs of that nature. But should you be disciplined around how you borrow? I think yes. And I think the IMF has set guidelines around what is the debt ceiling for most of the countries in emerging markets like ours. And I think the figure that the IMF tends to work with our market is around 50%. So if you are, so long as your debt is below 50%, the general feel is that it's not bad. But we've seen other successful economies that have borrowed significantly. And I spoke to you earlier to Japan. Japan is a highly indebted country. They've borrowed up to 230% of their GDP. America is slightly over 100% of their GDP. Highly indebted countries, but fairly successful. Fantastic infrastructure, fantastic economies and countries. If you look at Europe, a majority of countries are highly indebted, more than Kenya is actually. Even Germany is, as a percent of GDP, is highly indebted more than Kenya. Where we've seen a lot of discipline is in Asia, where you find people like China are probably at 25% of their GDP, fairly more disciplined around that. The Kenyan government has adopted an expansive budgetary approach in the last decade. So we've run deficits almost for 10 years. And each year we are running a higher deficit. But if you carefully look at what the government has been trying to do in the last decade or so, it's also invest in infrastructure. So most of our budget deficit, at least in the last decade, has gone towards funding infrastructure. We've seen Thika Road that was funded through debt, which was both from largely foreign. We are now beginning seeing the SGR, Standard Gauge Railway. That is again significant amount of debt. And the government also recently announced the annuity program for roads that will see about 10,000 kilometers of roads put in the country. And again, that will be funded by debt. So my view is that I'll expect the country to continue borrowing. The issue of borrowing domestically has got its own challenges because the surplus cash generated domestically has competing factors. The private sector wants the same money that the government wants, so it is generally a balancing act. So if the government sweeps all the money, it means then the banks will not allocate enough for the private sector. So that's clearly where the balance is. But is it excessive? My sense is not quite, really. We've not gotten to a crisis in as far as debt is concerned. The only thing that is not visible to me is whether the debt that we spend in the 70s or 80s or in the 90s or early 2000s was appropriately put on infrastructure. And maybe there's an accumulated portion of the debt we pay today that was probably spent on recurring expenditure. Maybe that's where they have a challenge. But going forward, as long as we are quite targeted around where we put our money and how we manage our debt, I would not say Kenya is anywhere near crisis or the likes of Greece. We've got a long way to go.